Discipline and mental toughness. How to build an unshakable mind and take control of your life. Introduction. I want you to think about someone in your life who seems unstoppable. Someone who shows up every single day, no matter how they feel. Someone who keeps their word to themselves, even when nobody is watching. Chances are, that person isn't more talented than you. They aren't smarter than you. What they have, more than anything else, is discipline. And underneath that discipline, they have something even deeper, mental toughness. Here's something I want you to hold on to as we go through this journey together. Discipline is not about punishing yourself. It's not about being harsh, or cold, or joyless. Real discipline is actually an act of self-respect. It's you telling yourself, I trust myself enough to follow through. And mental toughness isn't about never feeling fear, or doubt, or exhaustion. It's about moving forward anyway, with those feelings walking right beside you. So many people believe that toughness and self-control are things you're either born with or you're not. That's simply not true. Every disciplined person you admire built that discipline one decision at a time, often through failure, often through starting over, again and again. What separates them from everyone else isn't the absence of struggle. It's what they chose to do with that struggle. Over the course of this audiobook, we're going to walk through exactly how discipline works, why willpower alone will always let you down, how identity shapes behavior far more than motivation ever could, and how the toughest, most resilient people on earth actually train their minds. We'll talk about failure, about discomfort, about the quiet, unglamorous habits that build a life you can be proud of. This isn't going to be a lecture. Think of this as a conversation, one friend to another, about becoming the person you know you're capable of being. Let's begin. Part 1. What discipline really means. Let's clear up a misunderstanding right away, because it changes everything. Most people think discipline means forcing yourself to do things you hate. Grinding through gritted teeth. White-knuckling your way through life. And because that sounds so unpleasant, most people quietly give up on the idea of ever becoming disciplined at all. They assume it's just not who they are. But that's not what discipline actually is. Discipline, at its core, is simply the ability to do what needs to be done, regardless of how you feel in the moment. That's it. It's not about eliminating feelings of resistance. It's about not letting those feelings make your decisions for you. Think about brushing your teeth. You don't wake up every morning feeling inspired to brush your teeth. You don't need a burst of motivation to do it. You just do it, because it's built into who you are. It's automatic. That's what discipline looks like when it matures, not a daily battle of willpower, but a quiet, steady habit that no longer requires convincing. This is such an important distinction, because so many people wait for motivation before they act. They think, once I feel like exercising, I'll start. Once I feel inspired, I'll write. But motivation is unreliable. It comes and goes based on your mood, your sleep, your stress levels, the weather outside your window. If you build your entire life around waiting to feel motivated, you will spend most of your life waiting. Disciplined people understand something the rest of the world often misses: action creates motivation, not the other way around. You don't need to feel like going for a run in order to go for a run. You go for the run, and somewhere in the middle of it, or by the end of it, the feeling of motivation shows up almost as a reward for having already started. I also want to talk about the connection between discipline and self-trust, because this piece often gets overlooked entirely. Every time you tell yourself you're going to do something, and then you follow through, you're building evidence, quiet but powerful evidence, that you can rely on your own word. And every time you break that promise to yourself, even in small ways, that trust erodes a little further. This matters more than most people realize, because self-trust is the foundation underneath confidence itself. It's very difficult to feel genuinely confident in yourself if some part of you doesn't fully believe you'll follow through on what you say you're going to do. This is why small, seemingly insignificant commitments matter so much more than they appear to on the surface. Making your bed. Drinking a glass of water first thing in the morning. Going for a short walk, even when you don't feel like it. These actions rarely change your life directly. What they change is your relationship with your own word. And once that relationship strengthens, bigger commitments, the ones that genuinely do change your life, become dramatically easier to keep, because you've already proven to yourself, in dozens of small ways, that you are someone who follows through. Part 2. Why willpower alone will always fail you. Here's something that might surprise you. Willpower, on its own, is one of the weakest tools you have for building a disciplined life. This isn't meant to discourage you, it's meant to free you from relying on something that was never designed to carry the full weight of your goals. Researchers who study self-control have found that willpower behaves a lot like a muscle. It can be strengthened over time, but in any given day, it's also a limited resource that gets depleted the more you use it. Every decision you make, every temptation you resist, every ounce of self-control you exercise throughout your day draws from the same limited well. That's why, by 9 o'clock at night, after a long day of decisions, the healthiest, most disciplined person in the world can still find themselves reaching for something they know isn't good for them. This matters enormously, because so many people build their entire approach to discipline around raw willpower, relying purely on determination in the moment, expecting themselves to resist temptation through sheer force every single time. And then, when they inevitably fail on a low willpower day, they conclude something painful and untrue, that they are simply not disciplined people. That they lack the character other people seem to have. The truth is far kinder than that. The most successful, disciplined people in the world aren't relying on willpower nearly as much as you might think. Instead, they design their environment and their systems so that willpower barely needs to be used at all. Let me explain what I mean. If your goal is to eat healthier, and you keep tempting snacks in your kitchen, you're setting yourself up to fight a willpower battle multiple times a day, every single day. But if you simply don't buy those snacks in the first place, you remove the battle entirely. You're not stronger than the person who kept the snacks and resisted them through sheer force. You're smarter because you removed the need for that fight altogether. This is what's often called the discipline of design. Instead of asking, "How do I resist temptation?" disciplined people ask, "How do I build a life where I don't need to resist temptation as often?" They put their running shoes by the door the night before. They delete the apps that steal their time. They tell a friend about their goal, so social accountability does some of the work that willpower alone would otherwise have to carry. There's another piece of this puzzle worth understanding: the difference between decision fatigue and habit. Every decision you make throughout the day draws down your mental energy, but habits, once formed, bypass the decision-making process almost entirely. This is precisely why building routines matters so much more than relying on daily bursts of motivation. A habit doesn't ask you to decide anything. It simply happens, the same way brushing your teeth simply happens, without a debate every single morning. So if you've ever felt like you failed because your willpower gave out, I want you to release that guilt right now. Willpower giving out is not a character flaw. It's basic human biology. The real skill, the one worth learning, is building a life where you need less of it. There's another factor that quietly shapes willpower far more than most people realize, and that's the basics: sleep, nutrition, and stress. Research consistently shows that even a single night of poor sleep noticeably reduces a person's capacity for self-control the following day. This isn't a coincidence. Self-control draws on the same brain regions responsible for reasoning and impulse regulation, and those regions are among the first to suffer when the body is running on insufficient rest or poor nutrition. This means that some of the most powerful discipline habits you can build have nothing to do with willpower directly at all. They involve protecting your sleep, eating in a way that stabilizes your energy, and managing your stress levels, because these foundations determine how much willpower you'll actually have available to spend on everything else. It's worth mentioning one more practical strategy here: what's sometimes called implementation intentions, or simply if-then planning. Instead of relying on in-the-moment willpower to make a good decision, you decide in advance exactly what you'll do when a specific situation arises. If it's 7 in the morning, then I put on my running shoes before I check my phone. If I feel the urge to skip my writing session, then I commit to just one sentence before I'm allowed to stop. These simple, pre-decided rules remove the burden of moment-to-moment decision-making, which is precisely where willpower tends to fail most often. Part 3: The Power of Identity over Motivation. Now I want to introduce you to what might be the single most important idea in this entire audiobook. It's the difference between chasing a goal and becoming a person. Most people approach change by focusing entirely on outcomes. I want to lose 20 pounds. I want to write a book. I want to run a marathon. These goals feel exciting at first, but they often fade because outcome-based goals are temporary. Once you reach them, or once you fall short of them and feel discouraged, the motivation behind them tends to disappear along with the goal itself. There's a deeper, more powerful approach, and it starts with a simple but transformative shift in language. Instead of saying, "I want to run a marathon," you say, "I am becoming a runner." Instead of saying, "I want to write a book," you say, "I am a writer." This might sound like a small, almost silly difference, but it changes the entire psychology of how you show up every day. Here's why this matters so much. When your actions are tied to an outcome, every decision becomes a negotiation. Do I really need to go for a run today? I already went 3 times this week. But when your actions are tied to your identity, the question changes entirely. It's no longer, "Should I run today?" It becomes, "Runners run. That's who I am. So I run." The decision stops being up for debate, because it's simply an expression of who you've decided to become. This is exactly how the most disciplined people on earth think, whether they've articulated it this way or not. Elite athletes don't wake up each morning debating whether they feel like training. Training is simply part of their identity. A disciplined writer doesn't ask whether they feel inspired. Writing is what writers do, inspired or not. The beautiful thing about identity-based change is that every single action you take becomes a vote for the kind of person you're becoming. Every time you follow through on a commitment to yourself, even a small one, you're casting a vote that says, "I am someone who keeps their word." Every time you break that commitment, you're casting a vote the other direction. Over time, these small votes accumulate into an unmistakable identity, one you can trust, one that no longer requires convincing. This also explains why so many people struggle with consistency after a big, dramatic transformation attempt. If you try to completely overhaul your identity overnight, going from someone who never exercises to someone training 2 hours a day, your brain rejects the mismatch. It doesn't yet believe you're this new person, and that internal resistance often causes people to quit entirely within a few weeks. The wiser approach is starting small enough that your identity can catch up gradually. 1 push-up. 1 paragraph. 1 5-minute walk. These small actions might seem insignificant, but they aren't really about the physical result. They're about proving to yourself, in a way your mind cannot argue with, that you are someone who follows through. Once that identity takes root, the bigger actions start to feel natural, almost inevitable, because they're simply an extension of who you've already proven yourself to be. I want to leave you with a question worth returning to again and again, whenever you're deciding what to do next. Not, what do I want to achieve, but, who do I want to become, and what would that person do right now? That question alone has the power to completely transform how you move through your days. Part 4: How to Train a Tough Mind. Mental toughness is often misunderstood as some kind of emotional numbness, as if the toughest people simply don't feel fear, doubt, or pain the way the rest of us do. That couldn't be further from the truth. The toughest people in the world feel everything just as intensely as anyone else. What makes them different is their relationship with discomfort itself. Most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid discomfort. They organize their days, their relationships, even their career choices, around minimizing anything unpleasant. And on the surface, this seems reasonable. Nobody wants to suffer. But here's the problem: a life built entirely around avoiding discomfort slowly shrinks. Your comfort zone doesn't stay the same size when you avoid its edges. It gets smaller and smaller until even small challenges start to feel enormous. Mentally tough people take the opposite approach. They understand that discomfort isn't the enemy. It's the training ground. Every time you choose to do something difficult, something that makes you want to quit, you're not just achieving that one task. You're proving to your own mind that you can handle more than it originally believed. This is how psychological resilience is actually built, not through avoiding hard things, but through repeatedly doing hard things and surviving them. There's a concept worth understanding here, sometimes called the 40% rule. It suggests that when your mind tells you you're completely exhausted, completely done, unable to continue, you've usually only used about 40% of your actual capacity. The remaining 60% is still there, hidden behind a mental barrier your brain created as a kind of early warning system, long before your body actually reached its true limit. This doesn't mean you should constantly push yourself to total physical exhaustion in every part of your life. But it does mean that the voice telling you to quit is very often lying to you about how close to your limit you actually are. One of the most powerful ways to train mental toughness is through what's sometimes called voluntary discomfort, deliberately choosing to do difficult things, not because you have to, but specifically because doing so strengthens your capacity to handle difficulty elsewhere. Taking a cold shower when a warm one would be easier. Waking up earlier than you need to. Finishing a hard workout instead of stopping the moment it gets uncomfortable. None of these individual actions matter much on their own. What matters is what they teach your mind, again and again, that discomfort is survivable, and that you are someone who can choose to move through it rather than away from it. This training generalizes in a remarkable way. Someone who has taught themselves to sit with the discomfort of a hard workout often finds it easier to sit with the discomfort of a difficult conversation, or a stressful deadline, or an uncertain season of life. The specific challenge changes, but the underlying skill, staying steady while things feel hard, transfers across every area of your life. Self-talk plays an enormous role here as well. The toughest people in the world are not free from negative, doubtful thoughts. They simply don't let those thoughts have the final word. When a difficult thought arises, "I can't do this, this is too hard, I should quit," mentally tough people have trained themselves to notice the thought without immediately obeying it. They might even say to themselves, quietly, "That's just a thought, not a fact," and continue moving forward anyway. This small habit, repeated enough times, becomes one of the most powerful tools a person can develop. Breathing itself plays a far bigger role in mental toughness than most people ever consider. Under stress, the body's natural instinct is to breathe shallow and fast, which actually intensifies the feeling of panic and overwhelm, creating a loop that makes difficult moments feel even harder than they need to be. Mentally tough people learn, often through deliberate practice, to slow their breathing down precisely when their body wants to speed it up. This simple physical act sends a signal to the nervous system that the situation, however difficult, is survivable, and it often creates just enough clarity to make the next right decision, rather than being swept along by panic. There's also something worth saying about the difference between toughness and stubbornness, because the two are often confused. Real mental toughness includes knowing when to adjust your approach, when to ask for help, when to rest before continuing. Stubbornness pushes forward blindly, regardless of whether the current approach is working. Toughness is intelligent. It can hold both the willingness to endure difficulty and the wisdom to recognize when a strategy genuinely needs to change. Confusing the two often leads people toward burnout or injury, mistaking rigid refusal to adapt for genuine strength. Part 5: Embracing failure as part of the process. I want to talk honestly about something that stops more people from becoming disciplined than almost anything else: the fear of failing, and the shame that so often follows it. Here's a truth that every disciplined, resilient person eventually learns, usually the hard way: failure isn't the opposite of success. It's a required part of the process of getting there. Nobody builds a strong body without failed lifts along the way. Nobody builds a successful business without failed ideas. Nobody builds a disciplined life without days where they simply didn't follow through. The problem isn't failing. The problem is what most people do after they fail. So many people treat a single missed day, a single broken commitment, as proof that the entire effort was pointless, that they're simply not cut out for this. This thinking pattern has a name. It's sometimes called the "what the heck" effect. One small slip turns into a complete abandonment of the goal entirely, simply because the person's all-or-nothing thinking told them the streak was already ruined, so there was no longer any point in continuing. Disciplined, mentally tough people approach failure completely differently. They treat a missed day as exactly that, one missed day, not a referendum on their entire character or their entire future. They understand something powerful: consistency isn't about never failing. It's about how quickly you return after you do. There's a simple, practical rule worth carrying with you, sometimes called the "never miss twice" rule. If you miss a workout, miss it once, and get back to it the next day. If you eat something unhealthy, let it be one meal, not an excuse to abandon the entire week. This single rule protects you from the spiral that turns one small setback into a complete collapse of your progress. It's also worth understanding that failure carries information, if you're willing to look at it honestly instead of emotionally. Every time something doesn't go as planned, there's usually a lesson buried inside it. Maybe your goal was unrealistic for where you currently are, maybe you didn't plan for a predictable obstacle, maybe you need more support or a different system altogether. Mentally tough people get curious about their failures instead of ashamed of them. They ask, "What is this teaching me?" instead of asking, "What does this say about me?" This shift, from shame to curiosity, changes everything about how sustainable your discipline becomes. Shame makes people hide from their goals, avoid tracking their progress, avoid trying again, because trying again risks feeling that same shame a second time. Curiosity does the opposite. It keeps you engaged, keeps you experimenting, keeps you moving forward, because every failure becomes useful information rather than evidence of your own inadequacy. I also want to say something important about comparison, because it fuels so much unnecessary shame around failure. The disciplined people you admire, the ones who seem to have it all figured out, have failed far more times than you probably realize. What you're seeing is usually the result of years of quiet failures nobody ever documented, followed by a public success that looks, from the outside, like it happened easily. It didn't. It never does. There's a particular kind of freedom that comes from genuinely internalizing this truth. Once you stop expecting yourself to be perfect, once you accept that setbacks are simply part of the terrain rather than evidence that something has gone wrong, you become far more willing to actually try in the first place. So much potential goes unrealized simply because people are too afraid of failing to ever begin. They wait for a guarantee of success that will never come, because no such guarantee exists for anyone, no matter how talented or prepared they are. The people who end up building remarkable, disciplined lives aren't the ones who found a way to avoid failure. They're the ones who made peace with failure being part of the price of admission, and paid it willingly, again and again, for as long as it took. Part 6. The role of routine and structure. If discipline is the destination, routine is very often the vehicle that gets you there. This part is going to feel less philosophical and more practical, because I want to give you something you can actually use, starting today. Human beings are, at their core, creatures of habit. Whether we consciously choose our routines or not, we are always running on some kind of routine. The only question is whether that routine is serving the person we want to become, or quietly working against them. One of the most powerful tools disciplined people rely on is what's often called a keystone habit, a single habit that, once established, tends to create a ripple effect across many other areas of life. For many people, this keystone habit is something as simple as making their bed each morning, or exercising first thing, or waking up at the same time every single day, including weekends. The specific habit matters less than the discipline it represents, the daily proof that you are someone who follows through, even on something small. Morning routines, in particular, hold a special kind of power, and here's why. The first hour of your day sets the emotional and psychological tone for everything that follows. If your morning begins with reacting, checking your phone immediately, scrolling through other people's lives and opinions before you've even had a chance to think your own thoughts, you spend the rest of your day in a slightly reactive, slightly scattered state. But if your morning begins with intention, even something as simple as 10 minutes of quiet, a short walk, or writing down your top priority for the day, you carry that sense of intention forward into everything else you do. It's also worth mentioning the value of environmental cues in reinforcing routine. Disciplined people often use physical spaces to reinforce specific behaviors, a particular chair reserved only for focused work, a specific corner of a room set aside only for reading or reflection. Over time, simply sitting in that space becomes a trigger that makes the associated behavior feel automatic, almost effortless, because your mind has learned to associate that specific location with that specific kind of focus. Part 7. Discipline in the face of distraction. We live in a world engineered, quite deliberately, to fracture your attention every few seconds. This isn't an accident or a side effect. Entire industries have built extraordinarily sophisticated systems designed to capture and hold your focus, because your attention has become one of the most valuable resources in the modern economy. Understanding this changes how you think about distraction. It's not simply a personal weakness. It's the predictable outcome of living inside an environment specifically engineered to pull you away from what actually matters. This means that building discipline in the modern world requires a slightly different approach than it did in previous generations. It's no longer enough to simply try harder to focus. You also have to become thoughtful about designing your environment so that focus becomes the natural, easier path, rather than something you're constantly fighting against. One of the most effective things a disciplined person can do is create what's sometimes called friction for distraction, and remove friction for the things that matter. If checking your phone requires walking to another room to retrieve it, you'll check it far less often than if it's sitting directly in front of you, buzzing every few minutes. If your workout clothes are already laid out the night before, you remove the friction between waking up and actually training. Small environmental changes like these do far more heavy lifting than raw willpower ever could. There's also enormous value in something increasingly rare in modern life: deep, uninterrupted blocks of focus time. Constant task switching, the habit of jumping between your phone, your work, a conversation, and back again, doesn't just waste time. It actually degrades the quality of your thinking, because your brain needs time to fully engage with a single task before it can perform at its best. Disciplined people protect blocks of time, sometimes just 30 or 60 minutes, where a single task gets their complete, undivided attention, free from the constant pool of notifications and distractions. It's worth naming something honestly here: resisting distraction in the modern world will always require ongoing effort. There's no permanent fix, no single habit that solves this forever, because the systems designed to distract you are also constantly evolving. This isn't discouraging news. It's actually freeing, because it means you don't need to expect perfection from yourself. You simply need to keep returning your attention, gently and repeatedly, to what actually matters, every single time it drifts away. That returning, over and over, is itself the practice of discipline. Part 8: The Mental Toughness of Elite Performers. Across every field imaginable, sport, business, the military, the arts, the people who reach the very highest levels of performance tend to share certain psychological traits, regardless of what specific skill they've mastered. Understanding these shared traits gives us a practical blueprint for building our own mental toughness. The first shared trait is what psychologists sometimes call a growth mindset, the deep, genuine belief that ability isn't fixed, that skill and intelligence can be developed through effort and practice, rather than being some unchangeable trait you either have or don't. This belief matters enormously, because it changes how a person responds to difficulty. Someone with a growth mindset sees a hard challenge as an opportunity to develop, while someone with a fixed mindset sees that same challenge as a threat to their self-image, something to avoid rather than embrace. The second shared trait is an unusually high tolerance for delayed gratification. Elite performers consistently choose long-term benefit over short-term comfort, not because they don't feel the pull of instant reward, but because they've trained themselves to keep their eyes on a bigger picture. This is closely tied to the famous marshmallow experiments in psychology, which found that children who could delay gratification even briefly tended to show stronger outcomes decades later in life. The encouraging part of this research is that delayed gratification isn't a fixed trait, it's a skill that strengthens with deliberate practice, the same way a muscle strengthens with consistent training. The third shared trait is something researchers call process orientation, a tendency to focus far more on the daily actions within their control than on distant outcomes that aren't fully within their control. An elite athlete doesn't spend their mental energy obsessing over whether they'll win a championship months from now. They focus on today's training session, executed as well as it possibly can be. This focus on process rather than outcome actually reduces anxiety, because outcomes are always somewhat uncertain, while the process, showing up, doing the work, giving full effort, is always within a person's direct control. The fourth trait, and perhaps the most surprising one, is a healthy relationship with pressure itself. Many people experience pressure as purely threatening, something to be feared and avoided. Elite performers have often trained themselves to reinterpret that same physiological sensation, the racing heart, the heightened alertness, as excitement rather than danger. This reframe, sometimes called an excitement mindset, doesn't eliminate the physical sensations of pressure, but it changes their meaning, which in turn changes performance in high-stakes moments. What's beautiful about all four of these traits is that none of them require any special talent to develop. They are, at their core, learnable habits of thinking. Anyone willing to practice them consistently, over time, can build the same psychological foundation that elite performers rely on, regardless of their specific field or starting point. There's a fifth trait worth mentioning as well, one that ties everything together, an almost stubborn commitment to showing up, regardless of circumstances. Elite performers rarely rely on feeling ready before they begin. They've simply removed readiness as a prerequisite for action altogether. This might be the most transferable lesson of all, because so many people wait for the perfect conditions, the perfect mood, the perfect moment to begin pursuing something meaningful. Elite performers understand, often through hard experience, that those perfect conditions rarely arrive, and that waiting for them is simply another way of postponing the work indefinitely. They start anyway, in whatever conditions they happen to find themselves in, trusting that consistent effort will eventually create the results that waiting for perfect conditions never could. Part 9. Building discipline when motivation is gone. Let's talk honestly about the moments that matter most, not the days when you feel inspired and everything flows easily, but the days when you feel absolutely nothing, when the goal that once excited you now feels distant, even pointless. This is, without exaggeration, the single most important test of real discipline. Anyone can follow through when motivation is high. The real difference between people who achieve lasting change and people who don't isn't what happens on the good days. It's what happens on the days that feel completely empty of motivation. One of the most useful mental tools for these moments is separating the decision from the feeling. You don't need to feel motivated in order to follow through on a decision you already made, back when you were thinking clearly, with a level head, about what actually matters to you. This is why writing down your commitments in advance holds so much power. It allows a clear-headed version of yourself to make decisions on behalf of a future version of yourself who might not feel like following through in the moment. There's a helpful phrase worth carrying with you here: a discipline is a decision made once, not a decision made every single day. If you've truly decided, at your core, that you're someone who exercises, you don't need to relitigate that decision every single morning based on how you happen to feel. The decision has already been made. What's left is simply following through on a choice your past self already committed to. It also helps enormously to lower the bar dramatically on your lowest motivation days, rather than abandoning your commitment entirely. If your normal workout is an hour, and you have absolutely nothing left in you, do 5 minutes instead. If your normal writing session is 1,000 words, write 1 sentence instead. This isn't about achieving impressive results on your worst days. It's about preserving the identity, the unbroken thread of showing up, even when showing up looks nothing like your best effort. Preserving that thread matters far more than the specific quantity of what you accomplish on any single difficult day. I also want to gently remind you that low motivation periods are not permanent, and they're not evidence that something has gone wrong with you. Motivation naturally ebbs and flows, shaped by sleep, stress, hormones, the weather, 1,000 invisible factors well outside your control. Expecting yourself to feel consistently motivated every single day sets you up for unnecessary disappointment. The goal was never constant motivation. The goal is a system sturdy enough to carry you through the inevitable seasons when motivation simply isn't there. There's a particular kind of strength that comes only from these low motivation periods, one that high motivation days simply cannot teach you. When you follow through on a day when everything in you wants to quit, you learn something about yourself that no amount of inspired, easy effort could ever reveal. You learn that your commitment doesn't depend on your circumstances, or your mood, or how well things are going. It depends on a decision you made about who you are. That kind of self-trust, earned specifically on the hardest days, becomes the quiet foundation underneath everything else you build in life. It also helps to remember that the version of yourself struggling through a low motivation moment is not weaker or less capable than the version who feels inspired and energized. They're simply experiencing a different internal weather pattern. Judging yourself harshly during difficult seasons, as though your worth or your capability has somehow diminished, only adds unnecessary suffering on top of an already difficult moment. The wiser response is simply to meet yourself where you are, adjust your expectations honestly, and keep the thread of consistency unbroken in whatever small way you still can. Part 10: Living a Disciplined, Mentally Tough Life. As we come toward the end of this journey together, I want to bring everything we've discussed into one clear, practical picture. What does it actually look like to live this way, day after day, year after year? It starts with self-compassion, something that might surprise you as the foundation of toughness, given how often toughness gets confused with harshness. But the people who sustain discipline over an entire lifetime, not just for a few intense weeks or months, are the ones who've learned to treat themselves with patience, the same patience they would offer a friend who's genuinely trying their best. This doesn't mean lowering your standards. It means holding high standards while also holding real kindness for yourself along the way. It continues with consistency over intensity. So many people burn out because they try to transform their entire life overnight, throwing themselves into an extreme routine that simply isn't sustainable. The people who build truly disciplined lives tend to think in far longer time frames. They're not trying to win this week. They're building a version of themselves that can sustain the effort for years, even decades. A slightly smaller effort, repeated consistently for a long time, will always outperform an enormous effort that collapses after 2 weeks. It also requires learning to sit with discomfort, rather than constantly escaping from it. This doesn't mean seeking out unnecessary suffering. It means understanding that a meaningful, disciplined life will always involve some degree of discomfort, and that the willingness to stay present with that discomfort, rather than immediately fleeing toward something easier, is itself one of the most valuable skills a person can develop. And finally, it requires remembering again and again that discipline is built through identity, not through motivation. You don't wait to feel like the person you want to become. You act like that person first, in small, repeated ways, until the identity catches up with the actions, until the actions no longer feel like something you're forcing, but simply like an honest expression of who you've become. None of this happens overnight. There is no finish line where discipline becomes permanently easy, where mental toughness becomes automatic forever. This is a practice, renewed every single day, sometimes every single hour. But here's the beautiful part: every single time you choose to follow through, even in some small, unremarkable way, you are building something real. You are becoming someone your future self will be genuinely grateful for. I want to close this part with one final reflection worth carrying forward. Somewhere down the road, you'll face a moment that tests everything we've talked about here, a moment when quitting would be easier, when nobody would even notice if you gave up, when the old version of you would have simply let it go. In that exact moment, you'll have a choice, the same choice available to every disciplined, mentally tough person who ever lived. Not a choice about talent, or luck, or circumstance, but a simple, quiet choice about which version of yourself you're going to act like, right then, in that specific moment. Everything we've discussed in this audiobook exists to help you make that choice a little more often, a little more easily, until eventually, it stops feeling like a choice at all, and starts feeling like simply who you are. Conclusion. We've covered a great deal of ground together in this audiobook: the true meaning of discipline, the limits of willpower, the extraordinary power of identity, the training of a tough mind, the necessity of failure, the quiet power of routine, the modern battle against distraction, the shared traits of elite performers, and how to keep going when motivation disappears entirely. If there's one thread running through every single part of this journey, it's this: discipline was never about being perfect. It was never about never struggling, never doubting yourself, never wanting to quit. It's about what you choose to do in the presence of all those very human feelings, rather than waiting for those feelings to disappear before you act. You already have everything you need to begin. Not someday, when conditions feel perfect. Today, in whatever form today takes, with whatever energy you happen to have available right now. The disciplined, mentally tough version of yourself isn't waiting somewhere in the distant future. That version of you is built, quietly, one honest choice at a time, starting the moment you decide to begin. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this audiobook gave you something meaningful, something worth carrying into your own life, consider subscribing to the channel, because we'll keep exploring exactly this kind of practical, honest growth together, one story at a time.